For over 4 decades, Robert Downey Jr. has become one of the most iconic faces in Hollywood. From a promising young actor in the 1980s, he gradually established himself as an artist with rare depth in the film industry. In 1992, Downey stunned the world by perfectly embodying the cinema legend Charlie Chaplin in the film Chaplin, a role that earned him an Oscar nomination for Best Actor at just 27 years old. But the true peak of his career came many years later, when he became the soul of Tony Stark in the movie Iron Man, the film that launched an entirely new era for superhero cinema. From then on, Downey became the center of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, a franchise that has grossed over $14 billion worldwide and turned him into one of the biggest box office draws in history. Throughout that journey, he received a series of prestigious awards, including 2 Golden Globes, multiple SAG Awards, BAFTAs, and finally the Oscar statuette for his role as Louis Strauss in Oppenheimer. For many American audiences, Robert Downey Jr. is not just a movie star. He is a symbol of intelligence, humor, and the irreplaceable charisma of modern Hollywood. But behind those glittering achievements lies another story. A story that Hollywood once thought would end in tragedy. Before becoming Iron Man to millions of fans, Robert Downey Jr. once stood on the edge where fame and self-destruction collided violently. He grew up in a chaotic artistic environment where drugs appeared far too early in his life. As he matured, heroin and cocaine addiction began to control everything: his career, his relationships, and his very future. The late 1990s were a dark period filled with arrests, notorious court hearings, and even time spent in a California state prison. Hollywood turned its back on him. Studios called him uninsurable, a term almost synonymous with the end in the film industry. There were nights when Robert Downey Jr. didn't know if he would live to see the next day, but it was in that darkness that his will to survive began to take shape. Instead of letting the past bury him, he slowly learned to stand up, step by step, fighting against his former self. And it was that will, the will of a man determined to conquer himself, that turned Robert Downey Jr.'s story into one of the most astonishing redemption journeys Hollywood has ever witnessed. If the story of Robert Downey Jr.'s journey from the depths of despair to the spotlight moves you, please hit subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more extraordinary stories about people who have triumphed over fate. Robert Downey Jr.'s childhood was nothing like that of ordinary children. It had no peaceful afternoons, no clear rules, and no protective boundaries that a child needs to grow up safely. Instead, his childhood unfolded in a chaotic world where the lights of film sets, all-night parties, and people living through both art and rebellion blended into a picture that was both alluring and dangerous. His father, Robert Downey Sr., was an independent filmmaker known for his quirky, satirical, and rebellious style. He was a true artist, a man of boundless creativity, but also someone who lived in a way society rarely calls stable. In Robert Downey Sr.'s world, rules didn't last long. His friends were artists, actors, filmmakers, and people who lived fully in every moment. Parties often took place in their small New York apartment, where laughter, music, and smoke mingled until night turned into morning. For adults, that might have been freedom, but for a child, it was a world where the line between right and wrong almost disappeared. Robert grew up among people he admired, but who were also struggling with themselves. He learned to observe them from a very early age. He learned to understand humor, satire, and the hidden sadness behind adults' eyes. But at the same time, he also learned things a child shouldn't learn too soon. The most shocking moment of his childhood came when Robert was just 6 years old. One night, while father and son were sitting together, Robert Downey Sr. handed his son a joint of marijuana. There was no lecture, no warning, just a gesture that felt almost normal in his world. Many years later, Robert Downey Jr. recalled that moment with quiet sadness. He said that when his father shared that joint, He felt it was his dad's way of connecting with him, but in reality, it was also the moment his childhood ended too soon. A door had opened, and behind that door lay a path it would take him many painful years to escape. From that moment, drugs were no longer foreign in Robert's life. They became part of the environment he grew up in, something as present around him as music, movies, or all-night artistic conversations. While many kids learn to play ball or ride a bike, Robert learned to watch adults live at the extremes of emotion and creativity. Ironically, amid all that chaos, an extraordinary talent was also forming. Robert Downey Jr. began appearing in films from a very young age, often in his father's projects. He made his screen debut at just 5 years old. To many, that was the start of a prodigy story. But for Robert, it was just a normal part of life. The film set wasn't a workplace for him. It was like the family living room. He grew up among cameras, props, and actors transforming into different characters. Those experiences gave Robert an astonishing ability to observe people. He could read emotions, rhythms, and humor in a scene in ways many actors take decades to learn. But at the same time, his personal life grew increasingly complicated. When his parents divorced, Robert moved to California to live with his father. That change didn't bring the stability he needed. Instead, it pulled him deeper into the adult's limitless freedom. His teenage years passed between two opposites. On one side, a talent in full bloom, and on the other, growing loss of control. His friends remember that Robert could make an entire room laugh with just one line. He was smart, quick-witted, and full of charisma, but they also remember that sometimes, in his eyes, there was an inexplicable sadness. Perhaps because somewhere deep in his mind, Robert knew his childhood had been taken away too soon. While many children were still learning to understand the world, he had to learn to live in a world that was far too complex. And although his talent was beginning to catch Hollywood's attention, the seeds of tragedy had already been planted long before. Those seeds would grow quietly over the years, silently preparing for the storms Robert Downey Jr.'s life would face in the years to come. If Robert Downey Jr.'s childhood was like a chaotic storm, then his talent was like a beam of light that appeared too early in that darkness. From a very young age, Robert showed something that those around him could not deny. He was born to stand in front of the camera. His first appearance in a film came at just 5 years old, in one of his father Robert Downey Sr.'s projects. In that film, Robert wasn't simply a child standing in front of the lens. He displayed an uncanny naturalness, a presence in front of the camera that even many adult actors sometimes don't possess. To many people, it was just a small moment in an obscure independent film. But for those who witnessed the young boy Robert at the time, they recognized that he had something very different. An inexplicable energy, intelligent, sharp, and impossible to look away from. As he grew older, Robert began to show those special qualities more clearly. In his teenage years, he became known among his friends for his quick wit and razor-sharp humor. Robert could make an entire room burst into laughter with just a short line. He had the ability to perfectly mimic other people's voices, expressions, and mannerisms. That was a talent that would later become his signature in his acting career. But at the same time, something else was growing in Robert's life. Something darker, more dangerous, and harder to control. Drugs were not foreign to him. They had appeared in his life from a very young age, slipping into the adults' parties, into smoke-filled rooms, into moments when a child should have been protected. By the time Robert entered his teenage years, what had once been vague curiosity began to turn into a habit, and that habit gradually became a shadow that always followed him. While Robert's talent became more and more evident, his personal life grew increasingly out of control. He could walk into an audition and leave everyone stunned in just a few minutes. He could read a script and understand a character in ways that other actors took years to learn. But away from the camera, his life often descended into chaos. There were days when Robert was full of energy and creativity, but there were also days when he was completely lost. Nevertheless, Hollywood began to take notice. Producers and directors realized that this young man had something the film industry is always searching for: natural charisma. The camera loved him, audiences were drawn to him, and despite his young age, Robert had already started landing notable roles in films of the 1980s. To Hollywood, Robert Downey Jr. was like a star in the making, a fresh talent, a young face full of potential. But behind that attention, another truth quietly existed. The darkness had followed him from the beginning. It didn't appear suddenly. It didn't come from a single moment. It grew with him from his childhood years, from habits formed too early, from an environment where the line between freedom and danger barely existed. As Robert entered the early years of adulthood, he had everything a young actor could dream of: talent, Hollywood's attention, and big opportunities waiting ahead. But at the same time, he also carried something else that few people saw. A battle was raging inside himself, a battle between talent and self-destruction. And for many years to come, no one could be sure which side would win. Even Robert himself didn't know. But one thing was certain: his story would not be like any simple success tale Hollywood had ever told. Because for Robert Downey Jr., the path to glory would have to pass through abysses that few people survived to return from. Moving into the 1980s, Robert Downey Jr.'s life entered a phase that many would later call his rising star period. Hollywood at that time was looking for fresh young faces, actors who could represent the next generation of American cinema. And Robert, with his razor-sharp intelligence, strange charisma, and natural acting ability, quickly became one of the names drawing attention. Directors who worked with him all said the same thing: Robert didn't just act, he lived in the character. He understood the rhythm of a scene instinctively. He could turn simple lines into magnetic moments with just a look or a sarcastic smile. When he walked into an audition room, Robert often made the people behind the casting table feel like they were witnessing something special. He wasn't like the other young actors trying to impress. He simply seemed to exist in front of the camera, and that was enough to make everyone notice. In the early years of the 1980s, Robert began appearing in a series of youth-oriented films. Those roles gradually made him part of the standout young generation of actors at the time, faces that regularly appeared on screen and in entertainment magazines. But the film that really made Hollywood stop and look at him with a different kind of attention came in 1987. That was Less Than Zero. In the film, Robert played Julian Wells, a young man born into a wealthy Los Angeles family but slowly sucked into a vortex of drugs, loneliness, and self-destruction. Julian wasn't a villain. He was a broken human being. A young man who once had everything but was losing himself day by day. The role required a special kind of fragility. It needed an actor who could show the audience the despair behind the glamorous surface. And Robert Downey Jr. delivered that in a way that was painfully astonishing. His scenes in the film made audiences feel like they were watching a real person slowly sinking to the bottom. Tired eyes, trembling gestures, a voice that sometimes broke as if the character was desperately clinging to the last bit of control. Many critics later said that Robert Downey Jr. gave one of the most authentic portrayals of addiction ever seen on screen. But what made that performance even more haunting was a truth very few audiences knew at the time. The role of Julian Wells wasn't just a brilliant transformation. In many ways, it also mirrored Robert's own real life. While the movie told the story of a young man losing control because of drugs, Robert was also beginning to walk a similar path in reality. Drugs were no longer just part of the environment around him. They had become part of his daily life. When the cameras stopped rolling and the film set lights dimmed, Robert often returned to the habits he had started many years earlier. Robert himself later admitted that the role in Less Than Zero affected him more than he realized. He once said that during filming, the line between the character and real life began to blur. The emotions he portrayed on screen were sometimes the same emotions he was going through in real life. Ironically, this film made Hollywood believe that Robert Downey Jr. was an extraordinary talent. Critics praised him. Producers began to see him as one of the most promising young actors of his generation. Robert wasn't just a pretty face on screen. He was a real actor, someone who could bring depth and complexity to any character. To Hollywood, that was the sign of a future big star. But while the film industry saw a talent in full bloom, very few saw the storm quietly forming behind the scenes. The endless parties, the sleepless nights, the increasingly dangerous habits all were gradually building up like dark clouds on the horizon. Robert Downey Jr. was becoming one of the most talked-about young actors in Hollywood. But at the same time, he was also stepping closer to an abyss that very few around him recognized. And just like many great storms in life, the first signs of disaster often appear very quietly. Hollywood saw the light, but few saw the darkness growing behind that young star. And when the real storm finally hit, it wouldn't just test Robert Downey Jr.'s career. It would test his very ability to survive. After the success of Less Than Zero, many in Hollywood began to believe that Robert Downey Jr. wasn't just a promising young actor. He could become one of the great artists of his generation. But in the early 1990s, there was still one big question. Could he really carry a major film on his shoulders? The answer came in 1992, when Robert took the lead role in the biographical film Chaplin. This wasn't an ordinary role. The character he had to embody was one of the biggest icons in film history, Charlie Chaplin. Chaplin wasn't just a comedian. He was a global legend, the man who changed the way the world understood cinema. Recreating Chaplin's life and style on screen was a near impossible task for any actor. But Robert Downey Jr. didn't approach the role like a task. He approached it like an obsession. To prepare, Robert spent months studying every tiny detail of Chaplin's life. He learned to walk with the signature cane and bowler hat. He practiced the famous tramp character's waddling gait. He learned to play the violin left-handed, just like Chaplin did. He even trained in a classic English accent to recreate how Chaplin spoke in real life. Everyone who worked with Robert during filming said he almost disappeared into the character. When the cameras rolled, Robert was no longer Robert. He became Chaplin. There were days he stayed on set for hours after shooting ended, just to perfect a small gesture or an expression he felt wasn't quite right. When the film was released, Hollywood was nearly stunned. Critics praised Robert Downey Jr.'s performance as one of the most impressive transformations ever seen in a biographical film. Audiences didn't just see an imitation of Chaplin. They saw the soul of the character reborn on screen. That role earned Robert an Oscar nomination for Best Actor. He was only 27 years old. At an age when many actors are still looking for their first big break, Robert stood on the stage of Hollywood's most prestigious award. As he walked the red carpet at the Oscars that year, many believed they were witnessing the birth of a new cinematic legend. Major newspapers began writing about him as the finest actor of his generation. Top directors wanted to work with him. Studios started seeing him as a valuable asset. All the signs pointed to Robert Downey Jr. stepping into a brilliant future. But there was a heartbreaking truth hidden behind the applause and flashing lights of that Oscar night. The role in Chaplin may have saved Robert's career, but it couldn't save his life. When the award ceremony ended and the stage lights went out, Robert left the red carpet and returned to the life he had been living for years, a life where drugs were still present like a shadow that never left. To the outside world, Robert Downey Jr. had just reached the pinnacle of acting artistry, but inside him, the battle was far from over. Close friends later said there were nights after the film's success when Robert still fell into familiar spirals of self-destruction. It seemed that every time life opened a door of hope, some part of him found a way to return to the darkness. Perhaps because success couldn't instantly erase habits formed many years earlier. Perhaps because the wounds from his chaotic childhood had never truly healed. Ironically, Robert Downey Jr.'s greatest role at that time told the story of a man who also lived between the spotlight and profound loneliness. Chaplin spent his entire life making the world laugh while facing personal tragedies behind the scenes. And in some way, Robert Downey Jr. was beginning to walk a similar path. The world saw a brilliant actor shining brightly, but very few saw the man quietly struggling inside. After the Oscar night in 1993, many believed Robert Downey Jr.'s life had been set on course. They thought he would continue landing big roles, winning more awards, and becoming one of Hollywood's greatest actors. But they were wrong about one important thing. Robert Downey Jr.'s life wasn't a straight path to glory. It was a winding road where every step forward sometimes brought a dangerous step back. And in the years that followed, the storm that had been quietly forming in his life for so many years finally began to erupt. The mistakes, the addictions, and the self-destructive decisions would soon pull him down to a place few in Hollywood ever thought a talent like Robert Downey Jr. could fall. Because after the peak of Chaplin, his life didn't enter a golden era. It began sliding toward one of the darkest periods Hollywood has ever witnessed. After the glorious Oscar night for Chaplin, many believed Robert Downey Jr.'s life had finally entered a stable orbit. Hollywood had seen many young artists go astray, but when an actor reached the artistic stature of Robert, people usually believed success would pull them out of dangerous habits. But in Robert's case, the opposite happened. Success didn't calm the addiction that had taken root in his life years earlier. It only made everything more dangerous. Entering the 1990s, Robert's life began spiraling into a vortex he could barely control. Heroin, cocaine, alcohol, the substances that had once appeared sporadically in his life now became its center. People who worked closely with him later said there were days Robert arrived on set bursting with energy, creativity, and charisma, making the entire crew believe they were working with a genius. But there were also days he completely vanished. No one knew where he was. No one knew if he would show up for the next scene. The addiction didn't just ravage his body. It began destroying everything around him. Friends who had been with him in the early years of his career started to drift away, not because they didn't care about him, but because they no longer knew what to do to help him. There were midnight calls, promises to change, sincere apologies. But then, a few weeks later, everything repeated. Parties that lasted until dawn, days of disappearance, appearances with tired eyes and an exhausted body. Hollywood's attitude began to shift too. In the film industry, talent can take you far, but reliability is what keeps you there long term. And Robert Downey Jr., no matter how talented, was becoming a risk many producers didn't want to take. There were projects where he was cast, only to be replaced later. There were films where he nearly landed major roles, but studios ultimately chose another actor because they feared Robert might not show up on time, or worse, might not show up at all. The heartbreaking part was that Robert knew it. He knew his career was starting to crack, and in his rare moments of clarity, he also knew the cause was himself, so he tried to change. Many times, Robert entered rehab programs. He checked into recovery centers. He tried therapy. He tried cutting ties with environments that made him vulnerable. Each time, some people believed this might be different. There were weeks, even months, when Robert seemed to have control over his life. He showed up on time. He focused on work. He spoke about the future with fresh hope. But somehow, the old vortex pulled him back. Addiction was like a patient monster. It waited for a person's weakest moments. And for Robert, those moments always came when he thought he was strongest. The mid-1990s became a period of constant instability. To audiences, Robert Downey Jr. was still a talented actor appearing on screen. But to those in the industry, he was becoming a troubling story. There were production meetings where his name was mentioned with two opposing feelings, admiration and fear. Everyone knew that at his best, Robert could deliver a performance no one else could match, but they also knew no one could predict when he would fall back into the darkness. Meanwhile, Robert himself seemed trapped between two different people. One was the genius artist who could stand in front of a camera and turn script pages into real emotion. The other was a man struggling with an increasingly powerful addiction, and for many years, those two sides kept pulling him in opposite directions. What makes this story even more heartbreaking is that Robert never lacked willpower. He wasn't indifferent to his own life. On the contrary, many who saw him fight the addiction said he did so with every ounce of strength he had. But sometimes a person's will isn't strong enough to defeat things that took root too early in life. By the late 1990s, the signs of disaster were becoming clearer. The episodes of losing control were no longer small backstage stories in Hollywood. They were starting to become front-page news, and the storm Robert Downey Jr. had tried to avoid for so many years was finally drawing closer than ever. Because very soon, his battle with drugs would no longer take place in the shadows. It would play out in full view of the world. And when that happened, Robert Downey Jr.'s life would enter a phase that even Hollywood could never have imagined. By the mid-1990s, the vortex that Robert Downey Jr. had been fighting for so many years finally reached a point that no one could ignore anymore. The signs of collapse had been there for a long time. Disappearances from film sets, promises to change that repeatedly failed, long nights lost in drugs and despair. But 1996 was the year when everything truly exploded. That was the year when Robert's personal battle no longer stayed in the shadows. It played out in full view of the entire country, and on what seemed like an ordinary day that year, police pulled over the car Robert was driving on a road in Los Angeles. What they found inside wasn't just a minor mistake. They discovered heroin, they discovered cocaine, and they discovered an illegally carried gun. For an ordinary person, that would have been a shock, but for an actor who had once been Oscar-nominated, whom Hollywood had once hailed as one of the greatest talents of his generation, the news was like an explosion. Within hours, entertainment outlets across America were running the story non-stop. Robert Downey Jr.'s name no longer appeared in articles about film or art. It appeared in the crime section. Images of him in handcuffs being led away by police began spreading across newspapers and magazines. To Hollywood, this wasn't just a scandal. It was the moment a beautiful dream officially shattered. But the heartbreaking part was that this still wasn't rock bottom. Just 1 month after the first arrest, another incident happened that left all of Hollywood almost in disbelief. One morning, police received a call from a woman in Malibu. She reported that a strange man was sleeping in her house. When officers arrived, they found that the man was Robert Downey Jr. He had no idea where he was. Under the influence of drugs, he had wandered into the wrong house, lain down in the homeowner's bed, and fallen asleep as if it were his own. The story sounded like a bizarre scene from a dark comedy film. But this time, it wasn't a script. It was reality, and to the American media, it was clear proof that Robert Downey Jr.'s life was sliding down an uncontrollable slope. The headlines the next day no longer carried sympathy. They carried a cold, ruthless tone. Some newspapers called him Hollywood's greatest wasted talent. To the public, Robert was no longer the sharp, funny young man who had stunned audiences in Chaplin. He had become the symbol of a genius destroying himself. People who once believed in him began to feel disappointed. Producers who once wanted to work with him started pulling back. In the film industry, reputation can change very quickly. But loss of trust changes even faster. Robert's phone went silent. Scripts that used to arrive stopped coming. Projects he was once attached to began looking for other actors. And in Hollywood meeting rooms, Robert Downey Jr.'s name started being mentioned as a warning. He's so talented, some said, but he's too dangerous. What made it all even more heartbreaking was that even in his worst moments, many still saw flashes of the person they once knew in Robert. There were times he appeared with sincerity, with apologies and promises to change. There were times he spoke about wanting to start over, about getting back to work, about proving he wasn't the person the press was describing. But addiction is a ruthless opponent. It doesn't care about talent. It doesn't care about fame. It doesn't care about lost opportunities. And for Robert, that battle seemed to be growing more and more desperate. The events of 1996 didn't just shake his career. They marked the moment his life began free-falling. From here on, everything would get harder. Arrests, court hearings, failed rehab attempts. They would follow one after another in the years ahead. And the scariest part was that at that point, very few believed Robert Downey Jr. could find his way back. Because when a star falls from such heights, Hollywood usually doesn't wait for them to get up. It just keeps moving forward. But what Hollywood didn't know then was that Robert Downey Jr.'s story wasn't over. In fact, it was only beginning to enter the darkest chapter of his life. The chaotic events of 1996 were just the beginning of a far darker stretch in Robert Downey Jr.'s life. After the arrests, the promises to change, and the failed attempts at rehab, the legal system finally ran out of patience. By 1999, what many had feared finally happened. Robert Downey Jr., the man who once walked Oscar red carpets, who was once praised as one of the most talented actors of his generation, was sentenced to 3 years in prison. That sentence wasn't just a court decision. To Hollywood, it felt like a full stop. When the verdict was read, many in the film industry almost believed they had witnessed the final chapter of Robert Downey Jr.'s career. Because in the world of Hollywood, time doesn't wait for anyone. And an actor who disappears for 3 years is almost the same as disappearing forever. When Robert was taken to a California state prison, the reality of his new life hit him quickly and brutally. No more camera lights. No more film crews. No more meetings with directors or auditions. Instead, there were heavy iron doors, cold corridors, and a system where everyone looked the same in orange prison uniforms. For the first time in many years, Robert Downey Jr. was no longer called by his name. In prison, he was just an inmate with a number. A person stripped of every title, every award, every bit of glamour Hollywood had ever given him. For someone who had spent his whole life in front of cameras, that change felt like falling from a mountaintop into an abyss. People who knew Robert from earlier years said this period was when he faced the greatest shame of his life. Not because he was in prison, but because he knew he had brought himself there. During those long days behind bars, Robert had plenty of time to think. No shooting schedules, no parties, no easy ways to escape, just silence and the thoughts he had tried to avoid for so many years. To the outside world, his story seemed finished. The press no longer talked about Robert Downey Jr.'s talent. They talked about his downfall. Articles analyzing his career often ended with a sad question: how could such a talented actor lose everything? Meanwhile, Hollywood moved on. New faces appeared, new films were made, and Robert Downey Jr.'s name gradually faded from industry conversations. The most heartbreaking thing for many who once loved him was the feeling that they had watched a genius go to waste. An actor who once had the potential to become one of the greatest artists of his era was now sitting in a cell, wearing a prison uniform and living by a prison schedule. But for Robert, this time carried a different meaning. Because in the harshest circumstances, people are sometimes forced to confront themselves. No audience, no roles, no way to hide the truth, just their real self. For many years, Robert had run from the hard questions about his life. But in prison, there was nowhere left to run, and it was in those seemingly most hopeless days and months that a thought began to form in his mind. Maybe his life wasn't completely over. Maybe there was still a way back. But at that moment, almost no one outside of Robert believed that thought. To the rest of Hollywood, Robert Downey Jr. was no longer a rising star. He was a cautionary tale, an example of how talent, no matter how great, can be destroyed by bad choices. When the prison doors closed each night, Robert knew he had lost almost everything: his reputation, his career, the trust of the film industry, and the faith of many who once admired him. But he still had one thing no one could take away: the ability to choose his next path. And while the outside world believed his story was over, Robert Downey Jr. stood at a decision that would change the rest of his life. Because from the ruins of his career and reputation, one of the rarest redemption journeys in Hollywood history was about to begin. When the prison gates closed behind him and Robert Downey Jr. stepped back out into the world he returned to was no longer the same one he had left. The years behind bars didn't just take away his time. They also took away nearly everything that had once defined his life before. Reputation, trust, opportunities. Hollywood, the place that once saw him as a rare talent, now looked at him with an entirely different gaze. To the public, Robert Downey Jr. was still a familiar name, but in the boardrooms of the film industry, his name began to be mentioned with a cold, ruthless word: uninsurable. In the movie world, that was almost an irreversible sentence. When an actor gets labeled uninsurable, it means no insurance company is willing to underwrite a production involving them. And without insurance, studios can't risk investing millions of dollars in a project. It wasn't because they didn't believe in Robert's talent. Many of them still knew he was one of the best actors Hollywood had ever had. But talent couldn't offset the risk. And to producers, Robert Downey Jr. had become too big a risk. His phone no longer rang with audition offers like before. The scripts that used to arrive had almost vanished. Meetings with directors and producers became rare. There were days when Robert sat looking back at his life and realized that Hollywood, the world he had grown up in, seemed to have moved on without him. The most heartbreaking thing wasn't losing roles. The most heartbreaking thing was the feeling of being forgotten. In the film industry, being forgotten can be crueler than failing. Because when an actor fails, at least they're still talked about. But when they're forgotten, it's as if they never existed. Robert had once been the young man praised after Chaplin, the one critics believed would become one of the great artists of his generation. But now, many in Hollywood only mentioned him as a sad story, a cautionary tale, an example of how talent can destroy itself. Some producers even said outright that hiring Robert Downey Jr. at that point was like betting on a storm. No one knew when he would show up. No one knew if he could finish a film. And in an industry where time and money are counted by the minute, that uncertainty was something no one wanted to face. Old friends in the film business still called him from time to time. Some encouraged him to keep trying. Some believed that if he held on long enough, Hollywood might give him another chance. But at that moment, those words of hope sounded more like distant echoes than a real path forward. Because for most of the film world, Robert Downey Jr. had almost been erased from the map. An actor who once walked Oscar red carpets was now trying to convince people he deserved a second chance. And that was one of the hardest things any artist can go through. Yet there was one thing many people at the time didn't understand. Robert Downey Jr. may have lost his career. He may have lost Hollywood's trust, but he hadn't lost what had made him special from the very beginning. His talent was still there. His will was still there, and somewhere deep inside himself, Robert still believed his story wasn't over. But to prove it, he needed something Hollywood rarely gives to those who have fallen too far: a chance. And strangely enough, that chance would come from someone few expected. An old friend who decided Robert Downey Jr. deserved to stand up one more time. At a time when nearly all of Hollywood had turned its back on Robert Downey Jr., when studios saw him as too big a risk and the doors of opportunity seemed to be closing one by one, there was still one person who refused to give up on him. That person was Mel Gibson. To many in the film industry, Robert Downey Jr. at that point seemed like a failed project. But to Mel Gibson, he still saw the person many others had forgotten. An extraordinary artist, an actor capable of delivering performances few could match. The two had known each other from before, when Robert was at the first peak of his career. Mel Gibson had seen his talent firsthand, and more importantly, he believed that past mistakes didn't have to define a person's entire life. But personal belief wasn't enough to change an industry as big as Hollywood. The biggest problem at the time wasn't whether Robert had talent. The problem was that no insurance company was willing to underwrite him. In the film industry, that was almost an insurmountable barrier. If a movie had a budget of tens of millions of dollars, producers needed an insurance company to guarantee that if the lead actor had issues, dropped out, had an accident, or relapsed, they wouldn't lose their entire investment. But with Robert Downey Jr., every insurance company refused. His past was too complicated. The arrests, the failed rehabs, and the prison time made insurers believe the risk was too high. And without insurance, Hollywood simply couldn't hire him. It was at that seemingly hopeless moment that Mel Gibson did something very few were willing to do. He decided to personally stand up as a guarantor for Robert Downey Jr. Mel Gibson used his own reputation and money to convince producers that Robert deserved another shot. He was even willing to cover the necessary insurance costs so Robert could join a film project. That action wasn't a small gesture. In an industry where every decision is weighed by money and risk, for a major star like Mel Gibson to stand up and vouch for an actor labeled uninsurable was something that almost never happened. For Robert, that help meant more than any role ever could. It wasn't just a chance to work. It was a sign that someone still believed he could change. Someone still believed the real him wasn't the sensational headlines in the press. Many years later, Robert Downey Jr. repeatedly referred to Mel Gibson as one of the people who helped save his career. He once said that when almost the whole world turned its back on him, Mel Gibson was one of the few who still saw something worth believing in. And sometimes, in the darkest moments of life, just one person believing can make all the difference. Mel Gibson's help didn't immediately turn Robert Downey Jr. back into a big star. The road ahead was still very long. Hollywood still had doubts. Many producers remained wary. But at least, thanks to that action, Robert had something he had almost lost. A door opened to hope. In the years that followed, Robert began stepping back into work little by little. Small roles appeared. New opportunities started to emerge. But more importantly, he began to believe his life could head in a different direction. However, Robert Downey Jr.'s true comeback still needed something even more important than a career opportunity. He needed a reason strong enough to change his life forever. And that reason would appear when he met a woman who he later admitted saved his life. A woman who didn't just believe in Robert's talent, but believed in the person he could become. After years of sliding into darkness, after prison, shame, and a Hollywood that had almost completely turned its back on him, Robert Downey Jr.'s life finally reached a turning point few could have expected. That turning point didn't begin with a big role. It began with a person. In 2003, while working on the film Gothika, Robert met a young producer named Susan Downey. At that time, Susan wasn't yet the well-known figure in the film industry she would later become, but she had something Robert hadn't encountered in many others throughout the chaotic years of his life: calm and clarity. When Robert first met Susan, he was immediately drawn to her, not just because of her appearance, but because of the completely different energy she brought. Susan wasn't dazzled by Robert's fame. She didn't see him as a movie star. She saw him as a human being. And perhaps that's exactly why their relationship began in such a different way. Robert quickly realized he wanted to be with her. But Susan wasn't someone easily swept away by his charm or humor. She knew his past clearly. She knew about the drugs. She knew about the arrests. She knew about the years when all of Hollywood believed Robert Downey Jr. had destroyed himself. And so, right from the start, Susan told him something very clear. If you want to be with me, you have to change. That wasn't a gentle request. It was a boundary. Susan didn't want to become part of the vortex Robert had lived in for so many years. She wanted a stable life, a healthy life, a life where the past no longer controlled the future. For Robert, those words felt like a direct hit to the truth he had tried to avoid for years. In the past, many people had urged him to change. But this time, it felt completely different, because for the first time in his life, Robert didn't just want to change to save his career. He wanted to change to keep someone important in his life, and so he began doing what many had once thought impossible. He began truly fighting his addiction, not with short-lived promises, but with profound changes in his life. Robert started meditating every day. Meditation helped him learn to calm his mind, to face chaotic thoughts instead of running from them. He returned to martial arts training, especially Kung Fu, as a way to discipline both body and spirit. Hours-long sessions became part of his daily routine, but most importantly, Robert began the process of getting clean in earnest. This time, he wasn't doing it because of court pressure or fear of the media. He was doing it for a far more personal reason. He wanted to live a life Susan could trust. The process wasn't easy at all. Addiction doesn't vanish just because of determination. There were days Robert had to battle familiar temptations. There were moments when the past seemed to pull him back, but each time he remembered Susan's words, and for the first time in many years, Robert Downey Jr. began winning small battles against himself. People around him started noticing the change. He showed up on time. He focused on work. He became more disciplined in daily life. No more chaotic late nights. No more mysterious disappearances. Gradually, those who had once doubted him began looking at him with different eyes. For Robert, Susan wasn't just a girlfriend. She became an anchor, someone who always reminded him of the person he could become if he kept walking the right path. And in many interviews later, Robert often said that Susan didn't just change his life. She saved it. But at that point, even as Robert truly began to change, Hollywood still wasn't fully ready to trust him again. The scars from his past were still too fresh. Studios remained cautious. However, what few people realized at the time was that the biggest door in Robert Downey Jr.'s career was quietly preparing to open, an opportunity that, if it had come a few years earlier, he might not have been ready for. But at that moment, after everything he had been through, Robert had finally become strong enough to seize it. And that opportunity would come from a role the whole world would later remember: Tony Stark. By the early 2000s, as Robert Downey Jr.'s life began to stabilize more after years of battling addiction, Hollywood still wasn't fully ready to give him a major chance. He had changed. Those close to him knew it. But in the film industry, the past carries heavy weight. Studios still looked at him with caution. And then a strange project started appearing in Hollywood meetings. A comic book company called Marvel Studios wanted to try something unprecedented. They wanted to build a cinematic universe centered around superheroes. And the first film in this highly risky project would revolve around a character not many audiences knew at the time: Tony Stark, also known as Iron Man. The idea made many in Hollywood skeptical. Marvel wasn't yet a film empire back then. They were a comic book company trying to break into movies with limited finances. The Iron Man project was seen as a huge gamble, but their biggest problem wasn't just budget or script. It was choosing who would play Tony Stark. This character wasn't a traditional superhero. Tony Stark was a genius, a billionaire, a man who was brilliant, arrogant, charismatic, and full of contradictions. He was someone who had once destroyed his own life before finding a path to redemption. And one director believed only one person in Hollywood could truly understand that character. That director was Jon Favreau. When Jon Favreau began discussing casting for Tony Stark, he immediately thought of Robert Downey Jr. To Favreau, it was almost obvious. Robert wasn't just an excellent actor. His life mirrored so many aspects of Tony Stark, a talented man who had lived in chaos but had the ability to stand up and change. Favreau believed the truth in Robert's life would bring a depth to the character no other actor could replicate. But when Favreau brought up that name in meetings with executives, the initial reaction was almost always the same: worry. To many in Hollywood, Robert Downey Jr. was still a name tied to risk. His past with drugs, arrests, and prison time remained vivid in the industry's memory. Some executives feared putting an entire project in his hands could be a huge mistake. What if Robert relapsed? What if he couldn't finish the film? What if old scandals resurfaced? For a studio betting its future on a new project, those questions weren't small. But Jon Favreau didn't change his mind. He insisted Robert was Tony Stark. Favreau even said Robert's redemption story could become part of the film's appeal. When audiences saw him on screen, they wouldn't just see a superhero. They would see a man who had gone through darkness and was trying to become a better version of himself. After many tense discussions, Marvel finally decided to take the risk. Robert Downey Jr. was cast as Tony Stark. But even after the contract was signed, many in the industry still saw the decision as a dangerous bet. No one knew if the film would succeed. No one knew if Robert could carry the most important role of his career. But for Robert, this opportunity carried a deeper meaning than any role before it. This wasn't just a part in a superhero movie. This was his chance to prove his past wasn't the final chapter of his story. During filming, Robert brought everything he had learned in his years of self-transformation into the role. The sharp humor, the quick wit, and the vulnerability hidden behind Tony Stark's confidence. People on set later said that when Robert stepped into the character, it felt like the role and the man became one. But at that time, no one could predict what was about to happen. Hollywood only saw a risky project, with an actor who had a controversial past. Robert Downey Jr. saw something else. He saw one last chance to rewrite his entire life story, and when Iron Man was released in 2008, what happened next didn't just change Robert Downey Jr.'s career. It changed all of Hollywood. When the filming of Iron Man wrapped, no one in Hollywood really knew what would happen next. The movie was seen as a gamble, a comic book studio trying to break into the film world, a superhero character not yet truly famous with mainstream audiences. And at the center of it all was Robert Downey Jr., a talented actor carrying a past full of risk. But when Iron Man hit theaters in 2008, what happened afterward left all of Hollywood stunned. The film didn't just succeed, it became a phenomenon. Audiences around the world were instantly captivated by Tony Stark, the eccentric genius, funny, arrogant, yet deeply wounded. And what made that character feel so alive wasn't just the script or the special effects. It was Robert Downey Jr. Right from the opening scenes, audiences sensed something special. Tony Stark wasn't like any superhero before him. He wasn't perfect. He made mistakes. He was smart to the point of being irritating, but he also carried profound scars. And strangely, audiences felt the character was real. Because somewhere in there, they saw Robert Downey Jr. himself in every line, every sarcastic smile, every vulnerable moment behind the iron suit. The film grossed hundreds of millions of dollars worldwide. But more importantly, it opened something entirely new. After the final scene of Iron Man, a small detail appeared, a post-credits scene with the character Nick Fury mentioning the Avengers Initiative. That moment laid the foundation for what the world would later come to know as the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and at the center of that cinematic universe was Tony Stark, or more precisely, Robert Downey Jr. In the years that followed, what few had dared believe before began to become reality. Robert Downey Jr. didn't just return to Hollywood, he became the heart of one of the biggest film franchises in history. From Iron Man 2 to The Avengers, then Avengers Age of Ultron and many other projects, every time Robert appeared on screen, audiences flocked to theaters with unprecedented excitement. Tony Stark became an icon for an entire generation of viewers. A smart, funny, personality-driven superhero. But behind that character was a story many couldn't forget. The man wearing the iron suit on screen had once been someone Hollywood had almost given up on. And now, he stood at the center of the film industry. Marvel's success grew year after year. The films in the Marvel Cinematic Universe kept breaking box office records. And along with that, Robert Downey Jr.'s value skyrocketed. In just one decade, he became one of the highest-paid actors in the world. There were films where he earned tens of millions in salary, not counting percentages of box office profits. Those numbers weren't just money. They were proof that Hollywood had finally changed the way it saw him. The man once called uninsurable had become one of the industry's most valuable assets. Studios no longer feared working with Robert Downey Jr. On the contrary, they knew his name on a poster could bring in hundreds of millions of dollars. But perhaps the most astonishing thing in this story isn't the money or the fame. It's the journey. A man who once sat in a California state prison, wearing an inmate uniform and nearly erased from Hollywood, now standing at the center of a billion-dollar film empire. To many in the industry, Robert Downey Jr.'s comeback is one of the greatest redemptions in Hollywood history. Not because he simply returned, but because he returned stronger than anyone could have imagined. However, what truly makes Robert Downey Jr.'s story special isn't just his career. After everything he went through, drugs, prison, shame, and the skepticism of the entire world, he found something more important than the spotlight. A life he once thought he would never have, and nearing 60 years old, Robert Downey Jr. began looking back on his journey with a peace the young man of years ago never knew. After more than a decade at the center of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, after the name Robert Downey Jr. became a global icon tied to Tony Stark, many believed his redemption story was complete. He had come back. He had become one of the biggest stars on the planet. But Robert Downey Jr.'s life still had one final chapter few expected. A chapter not about superheroes, not about billion-dollar box offices, but about pure artistic recognition. In 2023, legendary director Christopher Nolan made the sprawling historical film Oppenheimer. The movie told the life story of J. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb. In that complex tale, Robert Downey Jr. took on the role of Louis Strauss's ambitious politician, a powerful figure behind the quiet political battles of the era. For many audiences familiar with the funny, quick-witted Tony Stark, this role was a complete shift. Louis Strauss wasn't a hero. He was a complicated man, cold, calculating, and carrying layers of suppressed emotion. And Robert Downey Jr. embodied that character with a subtlety that surprised both critics and audiences. In the film, Robert almost completely abandoned his familiar acting style. No more sharp, humorous lines, no more showmanship of a superhero. Instead, it was a quiet, controlled, and profound performance. The eyes, the silences, the small gestures all contributed to building a complex, weighty character. When Oppenheimer was released, the film quickly became a global phenomenon. But alongside the praise for the director and the cast, one thing especially caught critics' attention: Robert Downey Jr.'s performance. Many critics called it the best role of his career, a role that proved Robert wasn't just a box office star. He was a true actor, an artist capable of transforming across vastly different characters. And then, the moment few ever thought would happen finally arrived. In March 2024, at the Academy Awards ceremony, Robert Downey Jr. was announced as the winner of the Best Supporting Actor Oscar for his role as Louis Strauss in Oppenheimer. As he walked onto the stage to accept the golden statuette, the entire room rose in a standing ovation. It wasn't just recognition for an outstanding performance, it was recognition for an entire journey. The journey of a man once considered Hollywood's most wasted talent, a man who once sat in a California state prison wearing an inmate uniform and nearly erased from the film industry. And now, he stood on Hollywood's biggest stage, holding the most prestigious award an actor can receive. In his acceptance speech, Robert Downey Jr. didn't talk much about glory. He talked about gratitude. He thanked the people who believed in him when very few did. He thanked his family. He thanked the colleagues who stood by him through that long journey. That moment wasn't just a win for one film. It felt like a circle closing. More than 30 years earlier, Robert had stood before the Oscars with his role in Chaplin, hailed as Hollywood's young genius. But then, he lost everything. Drugs, prison, and collapse had nearly ended his story. And now, decades later, he stood on that stage once more. But this time, his victory carried an entirely different meaning. It wasn't just a film award. It was a symbol of redemption, proof that people can change, that the past doesn't have to dictate the future, and that sometimes the most beautiful stories aren't about those who never fell. They're about those who fell and still got back up. Nearing 60 years old, Robert Downey Jr. is no longer Hollywood's rebellious young man. He is no longer the man the press once called wasted talent. He is an artist, a husband, a father, and a rare symbol of redemption in film history. But what makes his story so powerful isn't just the Oscar or the billion-dollar films. What makes it special is the journey from the deepest darkness of life to the brilliant light of forgiveness and growth. And when looking back at everything that happened, people realize that Robert Downey Jr.'s story isn't just a Hollywood story. It is a story about the miraculous human capacity, the capacity to start again. When looking back at Robert Downey Jr.'s entire journey, it's easy to be overwhelmed by the dazzling images, the bright lights of Hollywood, billion-dollar films, the character Tony Stark becoming a pop culture icon, and the moment he held the Academy Award statuette on stage in 2024. But if we only focus on those glories, we miss the most important thing in his story. Because Robert Downey Jr. is not the story of a perfect man. He is not someone who never made mistakes. In reality, his life was once full of mistakes that so many people thought could never be fixed. He was once addicted. He once lost control. He was once arrested. He once sat in a California state prison wearing an inmate uniform when the whole world believed his career was over. There was a time when Hollywood nearly erased his name from the map of cinema. Studios called him uninsurable. Producers said his risk was too great. Newspapers called him Hollywood's most wasted talent. For many people, Robert Downey Jr.'s story should have ended there. A young genius, an outstanding actor, but ultimately defeated by himself. But what makes his story special is not how far he fell. What makes it special is that he got back up, not once, but many times. He got up when Hollywood no longer believed in him. He got up when his past became headlines in the papers. He got up when opportunities had almost disappeared, and step by step, he began rebuilding his life. Not with grand promises, but with small choices every day, getting clean, changing habits, staying disciplined, and learning to become the person he once thought he could never be. Those who witnessed Robert Downey Jr.'s journey often say his comeback is one of the greatest redemption stories in Hollywood history. But if you look deeper, his story is bigger than Hollywood. It is the story of a man who had to fight the toughest opponent anyone can face, himself. In many films, Robert played heroes in armor, battling enemies and saving the world. But in real life, his greatest battle didn't happen in front of cameras. It happened in silence, in moments no one saw, moments when he had to decide whether to return to his old path or keep moving forward. And what makes his story so powerful is that he chose to keep moving forward. Nearing 60 years old, Robert Downey Jr. is no longer the rebellious young man running from himself. He is a husband, a father, a respected artist, and a symbol of redemption. He still carries memories of his past, but instead of letting them define him, he turns them into reminders of who he once was and who he decided to become. And perhaps that is Robert Downey Jr.'s true legacy. Not the billion-dollar films, not the fame, not the awards, but a story that proves people can change, that the biggest mistakes don't have to be the final chapter of life, and that sometimes the greatest victories aren't victories over the world. They are victories over oneself, because some people fight the whole world. But Robert Downey Jr. had to fight himself, and in the end, he survived. The story of Robert Downey Jr. is not just a film biography. It is a human tragedy rewritten by willpower. When looking back at his entire journey from a child growing up in his father's world full of parties and drugs, where he first tried marijuana at just 6 years old, to a young acting genius shining in Chaplin and earning an Oscar nomination, people cannot help but feel a deep sorrow, because after that spotlight came a painful stretch of years: heroin addiction, cocaine, multiple arrests in 1996, sleeping in a stranger's house while high, and finally a prison sentence in 1999 at a California state prison. The image of an actor once praised as a genius having to wear a prison uniform is the most tragic picture in this story. However, what makes Robert Downey Jr. an icon worthy of admiration is not that he never made mistakes, but the way he stood up after losing everything. Mel Gibson's help in paying for insurance to give him a chance to return, and especially Susan Downey's appearance in 2003, the woman who told him he had to change if he wanted to be with her, became turning points of salvation. From daily meditation and martial arts to truly getting clean, Robert defeated himself before defeating Hollywood. So when he embodied Tony Stark in Iron Man and later won the Oscar statuette with Oppenheimer, those were not just professional victories. They were the redemption of a human being. For American society, where second-chance stories have always been part of the culture, Robert Downey Jr.'s journey reminds us that failure is not the end. A person can fall to the deepest depths of life, but if they dare to change and persistently stand up, they can still become a symbol of hope. If the story of Robert Downey Jr.'s journey to stand back up moves you, please hit subscribe to the channel to keep following real stories about people who have overcome adversity and rewritten their own destinies. Thank you for joining us to the end of today's story, and we'll see you in the next video with another life journey just as powerful and inspiring.